Juan Williams, Karl Rove with us now to analyze. Karl, let's begin with you. You've been a member of a lot of these trips from overseas. What's your impression about what you just watched and heard?
Wow. Yeah. First of all, rare to see these kind of moments. Two big disagreements, actually maybe three. One over the role of NATO. Macron saying, I stand by my comment that the alliance is brain dead. We need to revisit its role, revisit its mission, being critical subtly of the president on this regard. The president's putting the focus on, I've been the guy who has been getting everybody to pony up the money. Disagreement on ISIS, where Macron pushed the president hard on we need to defeat ISIS in Syria. Until Syria is solved, ISIS will not be defeated. The president not engaging that much on it. Trade, where there's a big disagreement. President saying, you're taxing our tech companies, we're going to tax your products that you send to us. There are two pieces of news, though, that also we shouldn't overlook. The president announcing that when they got Baghdadi, al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, that they got a list of the quote, donors, the people who were buying oil from Baghdadi, from ISIS, in order to fill the coffers. Big intelligence grab, but we hadn't heard about that before. And then the president also today asked a question. I think he may have misheard it. Do you support the protesters in Iran? And I think he may have heard Iraq, because he said we're not supportive of them. You know, the United States is now on record with a law signed by the president being supportive of the democracy movement in Hong Kong. I find it hard to believe that the official position of the president really is we're not supportive of the protesters inside Iran who are protesting the Ayatollah and the regime's
Let's see if there's a clarification.
Measures.
The answer is I don't want to answer that. Answer is no, I don't want to answer that with regard to.
You go back to that.
Well, he said we're not supportive. He then went on to say we're not supportive.
I don't want to comment on that, but the answer is no. All right, so Juan, the reaction in the room in the context of that conversation about the ISIS fighters, the president said to Macron, do you want to take the ISIS fighters back?
Right.
He offered an answer, Macron, to which President Trump said this is why he's the greatest politician, because that was one of the greatest non-answers I've ever heard. And it caused quite a reaction in the room.
I think it caused quite a reaction around the world, Sandra, because the idea that he would take a shot at Macron in that moment, again, we just don't see things like this in terms of the conversation between world leaders on the world stage. But Macron did not answer as to whether or not he would accept ISIS fighters coming back, and what we've seen recently in London, brings that to the forefront of so many minds. But Macron's position seems to be go after ISIS, and this led to what I think was the principal point of disagreement, which is over Turkey. Is Turkey, in fact, acting in accord with NATO precepts with regard to what we're seeing from the Kurds? Macron described them as our allies, people who have fought with us against ISIS. You can see the President of the United States, President Trump, saying, wait a second, Turkey is a faithful ally. We work with Turkey. We can work things out. And then you go into exactly what is Turkey's relationship to fighting ISIS in Syria, in Iraq. And I think that that's a major point of disagreement. The other one, of course, is Russia and NATO. And I think they still are at a distance.
To both of you, Karl, Macron sees a power vacuum in Europe, does he not? I mean, Germany's got its own internal issues politically. Great Britain's going to have a vote in 9 days. They're still trying to figure a way to break away from the EU with Brexit. Macron sees an opportunity, much like he did in August when the G7 went to southwestern France.
Yeah, well, look, historically, the French have always played this role, going back to the 1950s with Charles de Gaulle. There is a tension between France and Germany. Germany is a bigger economy, is seen as a more dominant player in Europe, and France is a little cautious about that. They don't want to be, Berlin-centric, and they've always served as a counterweight. They've also, remember, always had a sort of a disruptive view of NATO. At one point, they actually withdrew from NATO under de Gaulle. Macron has been talking about a European defense agreement, a European defense agency, in essence. So, yeah, France always plays a little bit of a disruptive role, but most of the time it's behind the scenes in the, settled with the cool, polite political talk in public. But today we saw it right out there in front.
That was then.
And both men went at each other and politely. but nonetheless in a way that we're not used to seeing at these international
disagreements
meetings.
were clear. I agree with you on that.
Right.
Macron's words, we do pay what we have to pay. President Trump went on to characterize the current state of NATO, Juan. NATO's come a long way in 3 years. It is fairer. He said, as for NATO countries that are not investing enough in defense, he says that they will be dealt with. Maybe I'll deal with them from a trade standpoint. Maybe I'll deal with them another way. We're behind you 100%, was the president.
So what you're getting here is the president's focus on, it's interesting to me, fairness. He kept using that word fair. This is fair or this is not fair. And in specific, he was focused on the money contributions to NATO. You'll notice Macron was like past that point. He's more interested in what does NATO stand for, and in specific, how do you define terrorism? I was really interested. He was of a mind to say that, you know what, terrorism to the Turks is not terrorism to us because they're going after the Kurds, the allies, again. But the whole notion of the importance of having some restraint against Russia and the potential, when the president mentioned the upcoming talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Again, that's Macron's focus. The president saying we need to move beyond Russia. We need to look more at issues like terrorism. It's a very interesting mix, but unbelievable on the world stage.
It's so packed with news, talking about the flexibility, very important, bigger picture, talking about Iraq, Iran.
Yes.
There's probably a suggestion in there about Moscow and even Beijing as well, if you take it a step further. I think the last point here that we'll make is that the president is very proud over the last 3 years that he believes he's gotten these European nations to pony up more for their own defense. He put the figure at $131 billion per year, Karl, in the NATO defense contribution per year, and he said that could go much higher. In the meantime, we're going to bring Ken Starr on here in a few minutes. You have a significant event at this hour tomorrow, Karl. You're going to have a press conference in London with President Trump, and Democrats and Jerry Nadler are going to lead an impeachment probe in the House Judiciary Committee. How do you size that up as Americans sit back and look at this and try and think about, you got constitutional scholars arguing the merits of impeachment, I should say, while the president's on the world stage. You reflect on that in what way, Karl?
Yeah, well, look, the NATO meeting has been scheduled for a year. I think Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff and Jerry Nadler could have put the best interest of the country ahead of their partisan desire to get going and delayed this for a day or two so that these two events are not conflated. It does not do everybody in the world knows the impeachment proceedings are moving forward, but this looks like a deliberate stick in the eye of the President of the United States in a moment where he's representing all of us, Democrats and Republicans, on the world stage. Let me say one quick thing.
Yes. You
You passed over it, but it's very important. 3 presidents in a row, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, fought to get the NATO allies to pony up. And say what you will about the president's methods and say what you will about his words, he is getting them to pony up, which is a good thing for the Western alliance.
Thank you, Karl.
A
Good to
very
have
good
you.
thing.
Karl Rove and Austin Juan Williams here in New York. Thank you, gentlemen.
You're welcome.
Thanks.